Well, everyone, welcome to the first episode of the DC Encyclopedia series, or the DC Character History series. I don't exactly know what I want to name it as of yet, but you get the point. So, the first episode of this series is going to be all about Steve Trevor, or his full name, Steve Rockwell Trevor. As we know, Steve Trevor is commonly associated with Wonder Woman. Over the past 80 or more years, he is usually represented as Diana's love interest, good friend and liaison, especially when transitioning from Themyscira to the US and the world in general. He is also the first man to set foot on Themyscira, so he should technically pat himself on the back, considering that is technically an offense to the women of Themyscira, and the result of that should have been death to Steve. So we are quite familiar with Chris Pine's portrayal of Steve from the recent Wonder Woman films. But who is Steve in the rich history of DC Comics? So some quick character data for Steve Trevor. His first comic book appearance was All-Star Comics, Volume Number 1, Issue Number 8, which came out December 1941. He is 6'1" in height, 195 pounds, blue eye color, blonde hair. His powers and abilities, well, he doesn't technically have any powers or abilities, but he is an expert pilot and military tactician. His allies are people like Wonder Woman, Amanda Waller, Etta Candy, and from time to time, certain members of the Justice League. His enemies are David Graves, Cheetah, Menagerie, and the Crime Syndicate of America. And usually he is affiliated with groups such as Argus, Justice League of America, and Team 7. So because there are so many continuities, we are going to take it from the beginning and bring it all the way to where we are currently now in DC Comics history. So starting with the Golden Age, which was back in the 40s. Steve Trevor was an officer of the United States Army Air Forces. He crash landed on Paradise Island, which is what they called Themyscira before they called it, well, Themyscira. Steve was then cared for by Diana, who eventually left with him to Man's World. When Diana came to America, Steve and Wonder Woman were essentially a dynamic duo, saving each other from trouble and fighting crime. Now, towards the Silver and Bronze Ages, which is the 50s to the 70s, and even a little bit of the 80s, Steve and Diana's relationship started to take a dip in the 50s and 60s. In 1968, Diana at one point decided to give up her powers and cut ties to Themyscira so she could stay with Steve permanently. Of course, he died in the very next issue to the hands of Dr. Cyber's henchman, a criminal that Steve was targeting. Steve didn't return to the comics until the mid-70s, where he was brought back to life by Aphrodite, but was slightly changed with the name Steve Howard, and had brunette hair instead of blonde. But in all reality, it was not Steve reincarnated at all. It was a god by the name of Eros, who was brainwashed into believing he was Steve. Other than Aphrodite, they were completely unaware of this deception for years. With the slight name change and the different colored hair, Steve took a job as a secret agent, which wasn't so secret since the government easily found out it was just Steve Trevor with dyed hair. A couple years later in 1978, he would be killed once again by a corporate government agent during a black magic ritual. Steve, yet again, returned in 1980, where he was actually another Steve from another Earth in the multiverse, and this is how it worked. Hippolyta, the mother of Wonder Woman, was annoyed with her daughter's weeping. Seems a little cold, but okay. She decided to erase parts of her memory using the Mist of Nepenthe. At least I think I'm pronouncing that right. The mist would ensure that any of Diana's friends, even the Justice League, would never remind her she already went through relationships or multiple deaths of Steve Trevor. Steve Trevor re-entered Themyscira in a crashing plane from another dimension. Since Wonder Woman's memories of Steve were erased, she took care of him all over again and returned him to Man's World. Steve and Diana would fall in love again and live through new adventures together, until Eros returned and told them the truth of Diana's memory wipe and Steve's abduction from another Earth. To make up for some of the deception, Hippolyta pulled the memories of Steve from Eros, the original Steve, that is, and put them into the alternate Earth Steve. That way they could both remember the past and things could go back to normal, I guess. But overall, the romance between Steve and Diana was restored, and in the final issue of the original Wonder Woman comic book series, they finally get married. Now, moving over into the modern age, which is the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s, up until 2010. In 1985, the popular Crisis on Infinite Earths storyline rebooted the entire DC continuity, so newer and updated stories could be told. The new continuity showed that Steve Trevor was much older than Diana. He was also not the first Trevor to have landed on Themyscira. Steve's mother, who was named Diana Trevor, crash-landed in the Amazon and saw that a group of Amazonian women were fighting a large monster. Noticing that they were going to die, Diana Trevor pulled out her pistol and killed the beast, although she sacrificed herself in the process. The Amazons honored her sacrifice, and in turn, Queen Hippolyta named her daughter Diana. It is also how Ares was capable of convincing and manipulating Steve to bomb Themyscira. Steve goes through with the flight to Themyscira, but before he drops the bomb, he has second thoughts and decides not to go through with it. His co-pilot, on the other hand, was a minion of Ares, who actually turns into a monster himself to try to continue the attack. And in turn, Diana ultimately saves Steve from the attack. Noticing that her Wonder Woman costume is heavily inspired by Steve's American flag insignia, Diana leaves for Man's World with Steve. Considering Steve was old enough to be her father, though, Steve and Diana remained very close friends and nothing more. Steve went on to marry Etta Candy and became Deputy Secretary of Defense for the US. Now moving to the New 52, which started around 2011 and lasted about 5 or 6 years. After the Flashpoint event in 2011, the DC continuity was changed and revamped again. In this continuity, Steve is an advocate for the Amazons and Wonder Woman's liaison for the United Nations. Steve does have feelings for Wonder Woman in this continuity, but these feelings are not mutual. Wonder Woman was doing the dirty with Superman. Steve Trevor does become the head of Argus, ARGUS, which stands for Advanced Research Group Uniting Superhumans. He also becomes the liaison for the Justice League, a member of the Justice League of America, and a group called T.M.M. Argus and T.M.M. were essentially Black Ops type units. Groups of people with high military training or people with superpowers. With Steve Trevor in charge of Argus, he formed a strong alliance with the Justice League. He took control of the Red Room, which housed the most dangerous technology in existence. He also took control of the Black Room, which housed some of the most powerful and dangerous magical items. He also oversaw the creation of the Circus in Detroit, which were interdimensional visitors coming through portals that were left behind Darkseid from his previous arrival. He also created Belle Rev, a massive supervillain prison, and usually where Suicide Squad members are held. Finally, moving on to DC Rebirth, which I believe is where DC is currently at right now. In 2016, DC decided to go with a soft reboot of sorts. Some things changed to fit the new continuity. Steve crash lands once again on Themyscira. The Amazons nurse him back to health, but there is a competition between the women to decide who will return and accompany him back to Man's World. Diana, of course, wins. The two become good friends and allies as they tackled multiple enemies of Wonder Woman's rogue gallery, who eventually do come together to create a group called Godwatch. Their romance thickened through their time together, and they once again became romantically involved. Now, for an added bonus, there's Elseworlds. I'll go through a couple of other versions of Steve from the multiverse. I won't go into complete detail, but these stories are definitely worth checking out regardless. They are also not canon, of course, but they are still interesting reads. So in an Elseworlds story called Wonder Woman Amazonia, Steve is a Royal Marine in the British Empire. He tricks the Amazonians into being loyal to him, and right after, he gets his military to slaughter all of the Amazons, except Diana. He then takes her to England and puts her through plays in front of live audiences depicting Bible stories. Diana eventually kills Steve in revenge. Brutal story. In Flashpoint, which came out in 2011, Steve was actually in love with Lois Lane. There is a point in the book where he is in London waiting for Lois, but is attacked by Wonder Woman and her Amazon warriors. She ties him with the lasso of truth, revealing that Lois was in New Themyscira, extracting information. Information that Steve could give to Cyborg that would help him and other superhumans stop the fighting between Wonder Woman and Aquaman and their respective armies. Right after Steve tells her, Steve dies as she chokes him to death. Another brutal ending for Steve. In Wonder Woman Earth 1, Steve's counterpart is very similar, although the biggest difference is that he is African American. And last but not least, in Justice 2. Steve's story taken from behind the scenes of the video game. In this world, Steve lands in Themyscira and eventually goes to London with Diana's help to fight World War II. After a couple of months, Diana wants to return back to Themyscira so she can receive her lasso, which will aid them in the fight against the Nazis. It is later revealed that Steve is actually a Nazi spy, and despite the growing love he had for Diana, he admits that there is nothing he loves more than his homeland. Wonder Woman then chokes Steve to death with the lasso, which would explain Wonder Woman's more aggressive nature in the Injustice video games. Yet again, another brutal fate for Steve Trevor. Well everyone, I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I really hope I was capable of maybe teaching you something about the character of Steve Trevor that maybe many people didn't know before. And seriously, this is just a series that could possibly go on forever because there is almost an unlimited amount of characters and just things to talk about in the DC universe as a whole. So like usual, if you did like this video, please leave a like and make sure to hit that subscribe if you want to keep up to date with more content, because I do have more of these DC characters history videos coming out very soon. But in the meantime, while you wait for future episodes, make sure to go to my DC playlist where you can watch every DC video I have uploaded so far to keep you occupied in the meantime. And until next time everyone, I will talk to you all very soon.